So this is not just the room where we ask ourselves questions, but it's also the time where you can get your burning questions off. So we're going to start our discussion with one of the questions we have prepared, but then feel free to raise your hand. We have a microphone here, you can ask questions. And to promote further our awesome Attentify app, if you feel more comfortable in writing your question down, we have an activity stream, so feel free to post. I'm going to try and monitor this occasionally. So if you have questions, you can also use this to ask them. To kick things off, and before Karen gets to ask her burning questions, I think we saw a lot of different angles to look at the question of SMEs and to look at the interplay between SMEs and place. But one of the things I would like to know and ask a bit the audience and the podium is, in how far do SMEs differ in what they can provide an area, a place, a city, a neighborhood, a region from larger companies, from other types of companies? And I think we had a bit of evidence already piled up on this one, but maybe to kind of refine a little bit, what are the key things in which they differ? Martin, you want to start us off?
So the question was the key issues that SMEs can contribute with, right?
In contrast to large firms.
In contrast to large firms. Well, okay. So, well, I think in my view, so one of the key issues is, first of all, that SMEs bring variety. So large firms, by definition, large firms, they can internalize variety, but they don't give the market thickness, the variety of suppliers, the variety and the, let's say, the variety of specializations that the magnitude of SMEs can do. That's one thing. Secondly, I think that SME, in terms of this argument about entrepreneurship culture or entrepreneurship business climate, I think that SMEs, I don't want to use that word, but they are better than large firms. Although I should say that, I mean, large firms are also important in terms of spawning entrepreneurs. There's this whole question about, the quantity of entrepreneurs that you spawn versus let's say, the quality of spawns. We have some results for Sweden saying that, well, large firms are much less likely to spawn entrepreneurs. A local environment with large firms might be less prone to, generate new firms, but the firms they spawn might be of higher quality and be closer to the notion of Schumpeterian entrepreneurship. So this is a complex and difficult question, I would say, but in terms of, let's say, variety and in terms of bringing an entrepreneurial climate, I think that SMEs are much better. And then secondly, I would also say that, talking about these more mundane forms of entrepreneurship, I mean, for cities, the whole type of variety that Jane Jacobs wrote about and stuff like that, I mean, from where does that come? Well, it comes from entrepreneurs and starting up shops, starting up different types of activities. I think that's really what I think that, from my point of view, one of the differentiating things of the SMEs.
Okay. Before we go on to the next one of the elements that struck me in your presentation was the question of scale.
Yes.
Where we talked about municipalities, we talked about local neighborhoods, and about these kind of positive effects that an SME environment has on entrepreneurship, on job creation. But what is the right scale to think about this? Do we need to dig deeper, and do we really need to go at the sub-national level? Can we think about cities? Can we think about the metropolitan areas? Or do we have to distinguish, as Peter was outlining before, between cities and suburbs?
Yes.
Where do these kind of positive effects end?
Well, I think that the notion of scales is very strongly linked to what type of effect you're looking at. So for example, so the way in which we enter the angle from which we started to analyze the notion of spatial scales has to do with the various micro foundations for agglomeration economies. So typically there are three forms, right? So one is cities thrive because people can share indivisible things, right? Second, you can have knowledge spillovers and information flows between networks of people and stuff like that. And the third thing is matching. Okay, so matching, a typical example of matching is that firms can better match input suppliers, and there's a better matching between workers and employers. And of course, these three mechanisms are likely to operate at different scales. So if you think about, the arguments about knowledge spillovers and so on, Then you come into the world of innovation districts, and where you are talking about things that operate at a spatial scale that is much smaller than the type of scale we talk about when we talk about sharing indivisible resources. Local labor market matching, in my world, the relevant scale then would be more like the functional region encompassing, let's say, an area in which commuting times are reasonable. And from the literature, we know that that's around 40 minutes, 1 hour. From what I know, at least from the literature on labor market mobility. So I think that there is you can never ask the question, what is the right scale? But rather the issue is, okay, what is the question you ask and what are the relevant mechanisms for that effect? And then think about what is the pertinent scale from that point of view, right? That's what I would say. I cannot answer the question in another way than that, I'm sorry.
It's actually not a bad thing, because one of the reasons we're here is not just to answer questions, but also to find the right questions to ask, to think also a bit further and to develop a bit more work in that direction. But Nadine, when we talk about the different outcomes, you had resilience, you had the employment part. How do SMEs differ in terms of large firms in their contributions to employment growth? Well, we saw a lot about this one, but also in terms of the resilience of the regions that they operate in.
I think that the main difference between SMEs and large firms come from the pro-cyclical or contra-cyclical contribution. I mean, large firms are very pro-cyclical because they tend to hire workers when the macroeconomic context is good, when the economic trend is growing, and they fire people in the economic downturn. So this is a big difference with small and medium-sized companies. In which a kind of proximity exists between the management and the workforce. Because in SMEs, skilled employees, human resources are quite rare, and they have to keep it when the economic conjecture is not that good. That's why they can help territories, places to be more resilient. And this is why we introduce the share of employment in business group, just to show that in the regions where these business groups have an important contribution to the economy, finally they are more fragile because, of course, in the ascending share of the cycle, they do better than the other, but when the downturn arrives, they collapse faster. Whereas if there is a large share of SMEs, the cycle is less, the slopes are lower, but they are more stable. And this is why we have to know more about ownership and control in the companies, because many local policies, many industrial policies aim to attract foreign or big groups in some places, and we show that sometimes the result, some years after, is not as good as expected.
And I think this duality between not just SMEs, but entrepreneurship,
yes,
and the interplay between the two, I think this is something we're going to come back to over the next 2 days, because I think there's much truth in there being very different channels in what a local embedded entrepreneur can contribute to the local area, as opposed to what a manager that is put there for 2-3 years does in a local manufacturing company that, as you said, is very much at the forefront, especially in some of our OECD member countries, in trying to attract those activities. But maybe attracting these kind of places also helps a bit stimulate innovation. Is this something, Sandrine, that we're kind of thinking about at the OECD as well, where you use the large companies to support the local entrepreneurial network, especially when it comes to the internationalization. A lot of that is driven by SMEs, but we know that global value chains and the international trade are very much driven by those multinational enterprises that are located in different places. Do you see a role for SMEs to kind of engage better in this process?
Yes, I mean, I mentioned it very briefly, but it's not just about internationalization, it's the cooperation between large firms and SMEs. SMEs could be the place where innovation takes place, where ideas are developed, are thought, and then they become a product, they reach the market, or they are scaled up to a commercialization stage within the large firms. And we have examples of innovation laboratories, of collaboration between large firms that provide SMEs with what they missed: skills, finance, a place to work, and offices and technology sometimes, for the SMEs to develop the prototypes. And once the prototype is ready for the market, then the large firm take over and commercialize the product. We have, for instance, example of Microsoft working with software developers with an agreement for cooperation in commercialization afterwards. So this is the type of relationship linkages that could benefit both large firms and SMEs. And then we have this dimension of internationalization, multinational investing in firms, in cities, in regions, and bringing technology, international technology, high standards, bringing new processes that could help smaller firms to reach a kind of state-of-art of practices or technology. They could also access some finance through the supply chain, through the multinational networks. So this is more thinking in terms of ecosystem, with these small firms working in kind of harmony and cooperation, symbiosis with large firms.
And these kind of ecosystems, it's something where, you know, when we talk about it, and the first things that pop to mind are also the nice images that Peter showed us. We see the center of Stockholm, and we see these ecosystems work in tandem. In Paris, we have now the Station F, one of the biggest co-working and interactive spaces. But is this also something we can see work in smaller places, in places that are not the top cities, the global cities, especially now when we have digital technologies at the forefront? Is this going to help us distribute the benefits of SMEs to the local communities, as well as the benefits of the local community to the SMEs more widely? Or is this something where digitalization will just mean it's the big cities keeping winning, where other places are losing out? What's your thinking on this?
Well, it's both, actually. I mean, we still are in a situation where big cities are the big winners. I mean, they attract entrepreneurs, startups, multinational. And if we look at the orientation of foreign direct investment, for instance, most of the inflow are coming to the largest cities. That's a fact, I would say. But that said, the digitalization and digital tools, internet, is bringing opportunity as well for SMEs and smaller firms in smaller areas, smaller cities, to participate to these international flows of product and services. The digital platform is a very typical example of small firms that could access information or could access finance through the crowdfunding, for instance, but also sell their product online to a broader market. So, I mean, it's both of them. But there is still a reality that is very strong, heavily rooted, I would say.
And one of the realities is also that these things don't come natural. It requires certain skills, certain capacities, and those are not easy to come by. We call it the access to strategic resources in the outlook, but ultimately there's also a role that SMEs can and should play in developing capacity and developing skills of the local workforce, and in turn they might need support to kind of go forward. Karen, from our work on local economic employment and especially the local dimension of skill development, what are the key lessons that we get out of that?
Yeah, well, first a couple of things. I think I want to just maybe add a little bit into the debate with the discussion of digitalization and the future of work, that actually the OECD has been producing a number of estimates on the share of jobs that are at high risk of automation or the share of jobs that are likely to change radically in the short to medium term. And overall, it's about 14% that are at high risk, and another 32 that are likely to change dramatically. And I think, you know, some of the statistics that came up in Sandrine's presentation, where you see that 2/3 of adults are reporting that they don't have the sort of digital skills needed, and that there's a potential challenge where SMEs could fall further behind if they're not fully able to access all of these digital tools to improve their productivity, that we're going to have some challenges to the education and training and skill systems. And we'll need to, I think, do a lot more about how to make this a lot more interactive, given the fluidity with which people will be changing jobs. And so there's a sort of national dimension and how those national policies are sensitive to the needs of different places, but there's a lot of local action that I think also needs to happen. And this is where SMEs and local authorities, I think, can interface more actively with vocational educational training, with other lifelong learning tools, because you know, the people aspect of the human resource aspect is something that is going to be critical for, it is now and it will be in the future, but we need to maybe rethink a bit how we're providing these services. I mean, if when we talk to some of the colleagues in our SME working party on these issues, they're very concerned about the investments they make will just mean that somebody will then leave and go to another firm, a larger firm. So the investments that they can make can sometimes be limited, and so we need to sort of rethink the sharing between firms and public education training systems, and how to structure those in ways that are more adapted to these different needs, both in terms of just the workers in general, but also to support the innovation priorities that Sandrine mentioned in terms of organizational marketing and other aspects of innovation. I mean, the several of the presentations highlighted that a lot of the SME employment growth, or the current pool and then the areas of growth, are not always in the sort of sexy, high-tech, small, born global, digital type firms. And so we need to make sure that our innovation policies keep that in mind, because they tend to have a high-tech bias in supporting firms, and that our education skill systems, which are often thought of in a sort of a separate track, it's different ministries, it's different systems, that we better link that. And I think the OECD will need to do more work on understanding how the local level can better support these links between SMEs and the local workforce.
Can I add something? So as I was listening to all of you, very, very interesting. Is that okay? I didn't see whether you approved it or not. Maybe I'm just. But so there is a whole other intermediate. I call it an intermediate economy, which is the intermediate economy that services very high end, including high finance, etc. So it is top-level lawyering, but you need lawyers who know about countries all over the world. So it's not one firm that can handle it. So this is a major sector. I mean, that is the central sector, for instance, in major cities that has grabbed, you know, land, central city land, because it needs all these little firms, and they have to be very interconnected. A second of time matters. And they can give you, you know, if you're about to invest in 15 different countries across the world, in specific locations, they can deliver the legal knowledge, the, you know, economic, etc. And that is a whole world. Now, I call that an intermediate economy, you know, and in our major cities, when you, I repeat myself now, when you think of who's grabbing the land to build buildings, it's that sector. It's not even, you know, fancy housing and all. It's that sector that has spread out, and you see it in all the major cities. Now, we're talking major cities, and that is a very interesting sector. It's highly networked. So just imagine if you're going to be operating in some foreign area, you need all kinds of knowledges, very specialized, not just Mongolia, no, that area inside Mongolia, and that is what it delivers. In other words, and they need to be networked, because none of those firms could survive by itself. You know, if you're going to sell 5 minutes of Mongolian lawyering, you know, once a year, you don't survive. But you know what? In Manhattan, in London, in Paris, you will find that. Have you come across that? He has his hand up.
While Martin answers, we go and get the microphone ready.
We'll make two proposals, one proposal and one question. May you please answer in 3 sentences to make it shorter and more dynamic? And my question is, venture capitalists, startups, and SMEs, do you see it as a threat in the long term? Because startup culture is based on venture capitalist interest. Start fast, grow big, grab land, everything. SMEs are not sexy nowadays, you know? Being like, I'm an SME for 25 years. I'm an owner of a small planning company, you know? And the bank is saying me, oh, come on, after 15 years of inaction, it was 10 years ago, you are coming to us and asking for 30,000 euros like credit? It's like, you are so small still. And that's, no. And do you see it as a problem? Because you know, like, startup culture, you grow, you get stages, you attract financing, you grow big, or not. And SMEs, and I would like 2 sentences from each of you. Thank you.
Okay, venture capital and their role. I think it's going to be tough to have 2 sentences just on this one.
Of course it's tough, but it's about discussion. It's not about like...
Volunteers. Anyone who wants to take a start?
I've spoken enough, so I'm not.
Very good.
I'm dying to speak, but there's a limit.
Sandrine?
Okay, I start. Venture capital is drawing a lot of attention because of the large volume of money put inside. But there are many different channels for SME financing. And the first and the main channel remains bank credits. Another option is a venture capital, which is more targeted for certain type of SMEs, like startup, like you said. But there are also alternative sources of finance that are developing using factoring, leasing, or the digital tools, for instance, the crowdsourcing, or something that I don't know very well, I struggle understanding, but all these ICOs markets as well emerging. So, I mean, it's still, financing is still an issue for SME. It's on the top of the issue we are dealing with. But we have signaled that currently the situation is improving. First, because the banking system is recovering from the financial system. There are more money available with credit conditions that are relatively exceptional currently. And secondly, there are new sources of finance that are emerging and that give some room for SMEs and more diverse SMEs to find more targeted financing solutions. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. It's a very high level.
Very good. The good news
I did
is
too much.
the good news is we also have our recently, I think on the 12th of April, we released our 2019 financial scoreboard on SMEs and entrepreneurs. So anything you ever wanted to know about financing of SMEs and entrepreneurs that we can measure, you will find in there. And I think we do have some discussion on the new forms of investment. Martin, please.
Okay, so sentence number 1. No, I don't think that there's a problem with venture capital. Venture capital is actually very important for a large part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Second sentence, it's only a problem if it creates, if the overall vibe in society means that we focus too much on, let's say, the really high-tech part of the entrepreneurial system and neglect, let's say, more mundane type of entrepreneurship. Third sentence, and the last one. There is some evidence from Sweden that the main problem for, let's say, regular SMEs and more mundane forms of businesses have more trouble getting finances for basic type of investments. Part of that is linked to a large closure of local bank offices in Sweden. Okay. Nadine.
Yes, thank you. Beyond VCs, there are also business angels that play an important role in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. My concern is that when you add VCs, BAs, crowdfunding, all of this kind of financing represent less than 5% of the total debt in SMEs. The most important player in the system remained the banking industry. So the question is how to compensate for the credit rationing, let's say, practiced by major banks towards smaller companies, and do business angels, venture capitalists, and so on, are adapted to solve the problem. In my opinion, it's not always the case, but we can discuss more precisely on this question later on.
Very good.
So what kinds of banks do they use? Who are the banks who are supporting these medium-sized? Are they regular banks, like just a bank rather than a financial operation? Do we know that or not? And it varies by country, probably.
In many countries, public banks still play a great role.
That's good to hear, actually.
Yeah. In France, for instance, BPI France grants credit, guarantees, schemes, and also direct fundings to small companies. And this makes a big difference private and commercial banks.
Yes, thank you.
Very good. Let's take it back to the audience. Andres.
Yes, I'm Andres Rodriguez-Posse from the London School of Economics, and since you mentioned ecosystems, I'm going to try to link 3 topics that have been touched in the morning so far, which one is entrepreneurship, the other one is city size and urban morphology. Saskia very interestingly put this morning that, we've been told that the best environment for entrepreneurship and small and medium-sized firms is the large city. But Saskia today, despite the fact that she has worked for a long time on big cities, challenged the idea that today the big cities represent the best ecosystem for this type. Sorry?
What was your final word? I didn't hear that.
That they represent the best ecosystem for the development of new entrepreneurs and small and medium-sized firms. Peter Egelund this morning also brought together the idea of the right urban morphology for this interaction and this emergence of new entrepreneurship. So it seems that because many small and medium-sized firms, many small medium-sized cities have got the right urban morphology, that this is the dawn of a new era of entrepreneurship in small and medium-sized firms. But the data, for example, that Nadine was showing for the case of France, it shows that in many places where we have the right urban morphology and medium-sized cities, entrepreneurship and employment generation are not taking shape. How can we reconcile both things?
Interesting question.
Anyone specific you would like this to answer, or is it general to the podium? Very good. Peter might be able to give us a start.
Very good, right.
Into consideration the regional economy around these places. Otherwise you cannot compare. That's my answer.
Okay.
Can I add something to the minimalism of Peter?
Maximize architecture.
Can I take? So I really think it depends on what kind of economy is dominant within a given city. It varies quite a bit from city to city. Yes, there is a lot of similar activities, but the core, what really pushes a city's economy can vary significantly. And I think that is part of the answer. That's part of the answer to your question, that it is not one format. It's different formats depending on the kind of city. I'm losing my voice.
You got water?
Well, I'll try water, sure. I'm Dutch, we can handle water.
Nadine.
Yeah, I think there is no there is no unique type of cities, and diversity within the cities is also very important. Sorry to take once again the French example, but 4 years ago they created by law 13 metropolitan areas, believing that metropolitan areas are able to drive the whole economy, and that the trickle-down theory applies to the spatial level too. Of course, it was not true, since when you compare Toulouse or Lyon to Lille or Nice, you do not observe the same capacity to drive the surrounding areas behind the core city. But the French legislator is very optimistic, maybe, and last year they decided to create 8 more metropolitan areas, which are not metropolitan at all, since you can find Dijon, Clermont-Ferrand, so secondary cities. And of course, the result is that it's not because you declare a place as a metropolitan area that you may observe what is happening in these major global cities. So there is a difference between the normative economy and the empirical research, which clearly does not confirm the expected results, and which does not confirm the univocal relationship between density and economic growth.
But in general, I think at the OECD we see these kind of reforms fairly positively, because we are not strong believers that links arise automatically. And if you don't have the governance arrangements in place that actually support collaboration across the different municipalities, across the different players, you're going to end up with a, let's call it, defunct local governance system that actually has adverse consequences for the local economy.
I fully agree.
If we look at, you didn't mention Aix-Marseille, maybe that was on purpose, but we have a very nice study where we see what are the struggles between the different levels of government, between the different political, even within the same political spectrum, the different beliefs in the different areas, and that it's not really a collaborative kind of way of trying to create a conducive environment for the local places. And the metropolitan label might be a bit high-reaching for some places, but ultimately, I hope we can agree that coordinating concerted efforts in an area where it makes sense is something very good. I think Saskia, sorry.
May I add something? You're completely right. Geographical proximity doesn't make it all. You need political action and political will to develop interaction between economic agents, between firms, between private and public agents. But if you don't do anything, if you don't insist upon the necessity to create cooperation between economic agents, geographical proximity is not enough.
Saskia.
I just wanted to, bringing in an American example now, Chicago and New York, the two major cities in the country in many ways. And people think that they compete with each other. Yeah, there might be competition around certain issues, but mostly they don't. What I found stunning about, now I'm talking about fairly complex cities, that the deep economic history of these cities shapes them. And they wind up with different forms of knowledge. Now look at Chicago and New York. You know, people think that they must be competing to death. Not at all. Chicago has a major financial center, but it is focused on, you know, very heavy industry, totally different from New York's financial center. So even when you took something as abstract as finance, there are differences. And I think that this matters, you know, to repeat it and repeat it, that cities do not compete. They often have very productive connections, even if they're minor. Yeah.
2 sentences from Martin on the topic, and then we take the next question in the back.
Yeah. Okay, I just wanted to go back quickly to the comment about the previous discussion we had about the scope for small and medium-sized cities in a world where much of the resources are in the big cities. I think that a major challenge for the smaller cities comes to the phase where firms need to scale up. Because, you know, when you start a firm, much of the research says that you don't do any location decisions. You seem to start a firm in the location where you happen to live. However, when you are scaling up, you enter foreign markets, that's where all the demand comes from, this more professional services, knowledge about writing international contracts, dealing with exchange risks and stuff like that. We have a lot of examples from Sweden. Just to name one from my own region, there's a massive entertainment. It's a gaming firm, very well recognized these days. It started in the small county in Blekinge, where I come from, right? But when they scaled up and their demand for more professional services came, they actually moved the firm to Malmö. Here, I think that policy could play a big role in the sense of facilitating networks to the ecosystems in the larger cities of such like Stockholm, for instance. I am very much in favor of a policy that the Swedish Regional Agency for Growth is doing right now, and where they sort of find small promising firms aiming to scale up throughout the country, bring them into Stockholm, connect them to the ecosystem, you know, venture capitalists, professional law firms, firms that sell these services and how to do business abroad, team them up, network them, and then they go back to the country. And that's a low-cost policy, and it's, I think, from what I've seen, it works pretty well.
Very nice.
Yeah.
I think that would open up a whole new discussion. At least I would have more questions, but we have one in the audience, and the gentleman's been waiting for a while.
Okay. My question is about UNESCO sites. UNESCO sites are very important for culture, for tourism, for local product. Are there any experiences about connection between SMEs and the UNESCO sites? Because in Italy, in Trento, we have Habitech that produce a standard, a cultural standard about real estate. And the President Xi Jinping asked to Italian government to make 15 twinnings between UNESCO sites, Italian and Chinese. And Italian SMEs involved in cultural issues are very interested in this.
Very good. So the role of culture, local attractiveness, and the place, we saw a little bit in the different presentations, but we weren't very specific on it. What is kind of the role of these institutions, and how can culture and creativity contribute to the economies? Maybe, Karen, you want to start us off, because...
We haven't done specifically on UNESCO sites per se, but we have done some work looking at culture and local development in particular, produced recently a guide to try and understand the different ways that actors, cultural actors, and local development authorities can work together, including with SMEs, including with even the health system, etc., to improve well-being of residents. So the OECD is trying to pursue the role of these cultural assets in local development in all sorts of different ways. I actually wanted to say also on the venture capital question earlier in the 2-second response, just that one of the challenges we've seen is that in Europe, often venture capital, if you fail once because it was a public provider, then you kind of fail forever. And in the private sector, in the North, sort of Anglo-Saxon, it's a little bit easier to fail, and serial failing is okay. So I think that's one important cultural distinction to make in terms of thinking about this. And we also hear a lot about venture capital ready, that a lot of the firms are just not ready and they need other supports before they get there. So just to answer the question on...
It's in a way flexibilizing
the
whole issue of, you know, of venture capital. Yeah. So that even a firm that, right.
Yeah.
Okay. With this,
are we done?
Sorry?
Are we done?
If you have something else on the cultural heritage and the cultural creative industries, I'm not forcing anyone to take questions they don't want to take.
Oh.
Very good. Okay. We do have a whole work stream on tourism, but sadly we didn't bring those colleagues, and they could have probably told us a lot more on how to leverage a UNESCO cultural heritage site for SMEs and integration of that with the tourism sector especially. We have another question in the audience.
My question is about how can we stimulate the creation and the growth of SMEs in a place, in a regional area in which the public economy share is very high. We can say more than 50% of the GDP of that place, that macro regional area. So it could be, it can fit also with the Trentino example.
So you're thinking about the specific
how can we stimulate the creation and the growing of SMEs in a place like this, where probably is easier to create cooperatives than to create SMEs?
So I know about one country that has a very high share of public employment. Nadine, maybe you want to start us off on this one?
Thank you. I'm not sure there is a crowding out effect between public and private economy. In fact, the relationship is more complex than this univocal relationship. The less public economy, the more entrepreneurship. There is some interplay. You shown that the local governance can play a role in boosting entrepreneurship. So, of course, if public services provide private goods or services, it won't work. But if public services create the good local conditions to promote entrepreneurship and create the good, let's say, local atmosphere to make business creation easier and more secure, this is a good result for entrepreneurship and economic diversification. So to take the example in France, in some regions, let's say, there is nothing. In peripheral regions, mainly overseas department or Corsica, are regions or places where public economy is a substitute to private activity. But in other regions, it's the case in Brittany, for instance, or in Bordeaux and in the surrounding of Toulouse, the public economy tends to make entrepreneurship easier because of the public procurements, because of the possibility to create a park, economic activity parks and clusters. So in this case, there is a positive effect.
Karen, I think we do know a little bit about the public sector.
Okay. I guess we do. So just a couple points on this one. One is the nature of the public sector employment, I think, is important to take into account, because you can have a lot of knowledge-intensive public sector employment that has really created very exciting, dynamic ecosystems, whether it's education-related, research-related. If you think of places that are clustered around research labs, etc. I mean, that's, you know, so I think we have to just nuance a bit the nature of the public employment, not just look at the, you know, at the basic statistics. Another point is just that we've done some work, and the book is out back, and Alexander can answer more of the questions on this, but if the public sector wage levels are set sort of at a national level, for example, and they are higher than what is competitive for private sector firms to compete sort of internationally, or that their, you know, that their products and services can be acquired internationally. So they have these other sort of cost imperatives that you could have some perverse effects to take into account when thinking about the local economy. So that's just another factor to include in the thinking about the sort of share of public sector employment.
Morgan.
I have a question about to Nadine and Martin, but also to everyone. I want to know if you've been able to see differences and variations in the French and the Swedish example in the effect of SMEs in relation to their size, because SMEs that are 5 people is very different than an SME that is 100 to 200 people. And I guess the underlying question is that, do you think that the current classification of SMEs is precise enough to understand the processes, but also the effects that they have on places? And do you think that's appropriate for current policies?
Martin.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a good question. Well, I must say that from a Swedish perspective, I would say that the current classification of SMEs up to 250 employees, I think is a typical 249 actually. I think it's quite large actually for being in Sweden. I mean, if you look at the geography of SMEs, and you define, let's say, the size threshold of 250 employees, you would find that there are actually quite many municipalities who are totally dependent on SMEs in the private sector. So they have no large firms whatsoever. Without having this is not an issue that I haven't never done any detailed research on, which size classes that really matters, I would say, but I can say this much. When we are measuring what internationally would be classified as small firms, and that is like firms with 50 employees or lower. Typically that bites much more in explaining local rate of entrepreneurship, in explaining also the rate of local employment growth than the same measure would do if it would be defined up to the 250. That's the best answer I can give, but you're right I agree with you perfectly that maybe we are a bit sloppy when it comes to just taking these standard size categories. So that's the best answer I can give.
Nadine.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Of course, there are many differences within SME categories. When you compare less than 5 employee companies, mainly most of them are sole proprietorship companies. Their main purpose is to create the job for the entrepreneur himself, and they are very fragile. The rate of bankruptcy in these companies is very high, and you cannot associate economic development, increases in productivity to this kind of sole proprietorship activities. So that's why when we consider SMEs growth, we put a threshold more than 5 employees to focus on Schumpeterian SMEs and not on self-employees. And this is also the OECD practice in some report, in some paper, and I think it's very important to make the difference between companies whose the objective is to scale up and companies whose the objective is to create the employment for the owner too. Another point is to enrich the current classification with the ownership, because the one difference also comes from the owners of the equity, and the difference between individuals and investment funds or other companies is also very important when you look at the employment growth rate.
Very good. Good. I think the question is also one of what is our target? We were at a very nice presentation where one of the vice presidents of the European Investment Bank was desolate because he just visited this awesome Dutch company that was a nearly a medium-sized company, highly innovative, highly productive, and it just was like a tiny bit too large to be considered a medium-sized company, because instead of having just 3,000 employees, they had 3,050. So he couldn't give them a SME-based loan. So for them, the threshold of 250 was already like way beyond what they were targeting. So I think the heterogeneity along what we see for different types of SMEs is something that's very important to the OECD as well, where we're currently developing an SME strategy, understanding what we can do for SMEs in different contexts, and getting a bit more at the understanding of what are the different dimensions that affect SME performance, as well as where policy targets should be and are required. We had a question in the back again.
Ivan Miroshnichenko, Free University of Bolzano. I just wanted to build on the note of one of the speakers who mentioned that we should also take into account ownership structure. Currently, we are based in the region of Trentino and Alto Adige, where the employment is driven mainly by family firms. It's like 90%. At the Italian level, will be 75. European level, the number will be the same. Also in an Anglo-Saxon environment, so it's or in Asia. So, but family firms do have different goals than non-family firms. So my first question is about the role of family firms in the statistics that you presented. And a second question regarding empirical evidence that you provided. If you, as far as I understood, you based it mainly on employment growth. As far as the firm growth literature, some of people take sales growth, someone takes growth in assets, some do measure as you do, using employment statistics. My question will be the following. If you look at the data starting from 60s, 70s, and you take 5 or 10 years growth rates, will be the same positive effect as you've shown, or not really? Thank you.
Very good.
The long-term models are very difficult to run because there are many changes in the structure of the data set. So there are discontinuities concerning industry, concerning institutions, and there is a nice paper by Richard Schirmer, Laurent Terral, published in an online journal with French data, but they are not panel data, but several cross-section analyses, and they show that the role of the different possibly explanatory variables change along the time. So, of course, when you look at the 60s, the local conditions did not play the same role in the different areas. The owner matters, and I think it is especially the case in France because in 30 years there is a kind of transition. 30 years ago, France looks like Germany. I mean, a family business was dominant, and a direct control from the families on the companies was the rule. Nowadays, things are very different because there were a lot of mergers and acquisitions of the most dynamic SMEs by corporate groups. It was the case in very dynamic industries, micromechanics, for instance, biotechs, in which SMEs do not have time to scale up, that they are immediately bought by large companies. And of course, first of all, we cannot follow them anymore since the ID numbers disappears from the registers. But even if you can find the information about the becoming of the assets, it is very difficult to control for the effect of the merger and acquisition, since the government schemes is different. But I think that it is quite specific to France. As far as I know, it's not the case in Germany, it's not the case in Italy, and this is why I'm so focused on these questions.
Very good.